Welcome. We are going to get started. My name is Paul Putz. I am the Assistant Director of the Faith and Sports Institute, and this is our Faith and Sports Forum. These are events we hold about once or twice a year, really just an opportunity to have a conversation on issues related to sports with Christian thinkers. One of our goals at the Faith and Sports Institute is to think deeply about the way that sports forms and shapes us. And we've often found that it's helpful to step outside sometimes from sports insiders and to actually get a sense and a perspective from people who study the world, who study culture particularly. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to be talking with guests who aren't necessarily sports experts. I don't want to sell you short, Katelyn and Justin, but my sense is that you're not elite level athletes. But what you are gifted at is thinking, writing deeply, communicating about the intricacies of culture and how Christians should relate to culture. And so I know that I've read both of your books that you put out this year. Katelyn, you put out a book on celebrities for Jesus, looking at celebrity culture in the church. Justin, your book, Interpreting Your World, which looks at different lenses that we can use to engage with culture. And both of those books are excellent. And I thought, I want people involved in sports to read these books. That's kind of my goal behind inviting Katelyn and Justin to be a part of this conversation. So Katelyn, Justin, thank you so much for being a part of this and for joining us for this conversation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Typing into the chat box the link to the website where we have information on the forum. This is where you can go to read Katelyn's bio, also to read Justin's bio. Katelyn is an author, an editor, a journalist. She's written all over the place, is in many podcasts. So if you like what you hear tonight from Katelyn, check out her website. You can certainly go deeper into conversations she's had on these topics. And Justin is a theology professor, former pastor, lives in the Midwest. I didn't tell Justin this ahead of time, but I'm from Nebraska. So the fact that he's in Iowa at Dordt University doing his thing, I love that. We actually played Dordt back in the day when I was a little small college basketball player in Nebraska. We got to battle on the basketball court with Dordt University. So Justin, I appreciate having a fellow Midwesterner here.
Yeah, did you win?
No, we got destroyed, actually. Dort's small, but we were even smaller than Dordt. And Katelyn, are you a Midwesterner as well?
I am. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, and then went to school in Michigan and then lived in the Chicago suburbs for a long time.
Okay, excellent. So we've got a Midwestern panel holding down the fort tonight. That's great. Okay, let's get started with our conversation. What I've asked both Katelyn and Justin to do is to take their books and to really give us a few highlights, a few big themes from their books, kind of explain to them why their books could be helpful for people who are interested in sports. Now, these are not books about sports. They are books about culture. And so because sports are a part of culture, I think both of these can be really helpful for us to understand sports better. And so they're each going to have about 5 minutes to share a little bit about their book, give us the highlights. So if you can do that in 5 minutes, it's got to be tough when you've written a whole book on it. And then we'll use that as just a framework for us to consider some of their ideas before we launch into the Q&A time, where you will be free to ask any questions you might have from Katelyn or Justin. So that is the plan in terms of format. We're going to start off with Justin. And so Justin, would you tell us a little bit about your book, give us a few of the highlights, and then how it might connect or relate to sports?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks, Paul, so much for hosting this. And it's a real privilege to get to talk about my book in the context of sports. My book is an attempt, and really my larger project is an attempt to offer something like an alternative approach to cultural engagement besides culture war. I am very influenced by artist Mako Fujimura, who talks about culture being not a battle to fight or a battle to be won, but more of a polluted space, a polluted ecosystem, and to approach that then in the metaphor of culture care rather than culture war. So if gardening instead of war is our primary metaphor, then yeah, there will be things to resist and there will be things to uproot. But the larger project requires loving attention and the act of planting of beautiful things. So there needs to be a great deal of curiosity on the part of Christians when it comes to culture. And there also needs to be a great deal of creativity on the part of Christians when it comes to culture, not just resistance, rejection. There do need to be judgments that we make, of course, but it should be nested in this larger project of caring for culture. So my book would look at the world of sports through 5 lenses, and the 5 lenses are meaning, power, ethics, religion, and aesthetics. So briefly, meaning would be sports as a framework of meaning, something that secures our fit in the world. And then power would look at sports in service of power, something that's potentially exploitative, something that maybe distracts us from the work of justice. Ethics would look at sports as something that creates these moral communities that pursue some form of flourishing together. The religious lens would look at sports as a source of transcendence. And then the aesthetic lens would look at sports as under the rubric of play, something that elicits our delight, directs our desire, just for the heaven of it. There's some things that we just do just because of the joy it brings us, and that's the aesthetic dimension. And Paul said, don't try to talk about all 5 lenses, but I just did. I'm just going to pick one, though, to go a little bit more in depth, on, and it'll be the religious lens, maybe the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to sports. I teach classes here at Dort on pop culture, and I always ask students to tell me about something in pop culture that's been really meaningful to them. And I'm always moved by the sorts of things that they bring up. And almost always, though, about a third of the students will pick something from the world of sports. So they will talk about feeling connected to a particular fandom, Minnesota Vikings or Nebraska football or something like that. And they'll talk about watching games as almost a ritual experience for their friends and families. Or they'll say, I follow that team religiously. And I always point out that adverb, religiously. It's connected to regularity, but they don't say I follow them regularly. To say that you follow something religiously signals both concern. There's a layer of depth of importance, and also consistency, that there is an ordering and integrative function in everyday life. And I think sports cast this religious spell in some ways because it taps into traditional pillars of religion, meaning, purpose, community, ritual. And it also offers experiences of transcendence. There's this great phrase from Emil Durkheim, collective effervescence. It's this idea that when a bunch of people are together, thousands of people are together, that they feel this sort of electricity from being together. So you think of, fans who witness a game-winning score, a home run, something like that, which leads fanatics, of course, not just to scream and shout, but also to embrace total strangers in celebration. I remember going to Los Angeles and going to a Dodgers game in between sort of LA opening up and closing down again must have been 2021. And just immediately how quickly everybody was high-fiving again at the Dodgers game. There's something about that we just sort of snap back into place. Because when we are in this sort of collective effervescence, we're tapping into something that extends beyond the ordinary bonds of kinship. Psychologists like Jonathan Haidt talk about flipping a hive switch, where some sort of experience causes us to feel like we are connected to something larger than ourselves. And when that switch is flipped, we behave groupishly. We're more likely to sacrifice our self-interest. We're less likely to think about ourselves. And he cites all these studies where, in addition to traditional religious expressions, the other things that induce this sort of hive switch flipping are the experience of awe in nature, team-based competition, and psychedelics. They've all been shown to kind of give this sense of euphoria of being a part of something larger. And so, in other words, sports is activating a religious impulse, a hunger to connect to something larger, something lasting, that seems like it's hardwired into us. It's part of our structure. Now, the question a theologian wants to ask, and I'm almost done here, is whether the hits of euphoria and connection that sports provide are thick enough to integrate and inform a full human life. So a religion based on sports it lacks sort of both the metaphysical and ethical rigor, that an actual fully developed religious system. We need something more than that. And because of that, therefore, we should also be suspicious of interests that want to commodify the experience of connection. This is the power dimension now that we're starting to talk about. And so I would want to ask how sports, like many cultural phenomena, stirs up longings that it cannot itself fulfill. And if we look for it to do that, then we begin to be in danger of idolatry, and it becomes malformative in many ways. And then finally, if there is a God, then we would want to ask how God might show up in the midst of these religious practices, and call them into question, correct them, but also in some sense complete them, because I don't see faith primarily as replacing cultural practices, but rather healing and fulfilling them, because in my theology, everything that is truly human is healed, not replaced. And so that there's something here in the world of sports that is good. There's something good about it that needs to be healed.
My background is as a historian. And so one of the things I appreciated about your book was that idea that you just articulated it of fulfillment. And I'm paraphrasing, but to use the phrase that every culture can be a host for the gospel. And I know 100 years ago, for a lot of Christians in the United States, there was a hostility to sports, almost as if it was either you're a Christian or you're a professional athlete. There was little sense that you could be both. And so it's interesting to me, and your book articulates this well, this idea that actually sport is an activity in which Christians can be present, they can be engaged. And yet there are many layers to that, the power dimensions, the ethical dimensions, that also remind us that there could be problems with how we engage with sports. And so I love how you bring that about. Something else, when you talk about religion and the religious dimension of sports, I was thinking about reading your book, how it ties in with what Katelyn will talk about probably in just a second. But here's something you say. This is a quote from page 100. I wrote this one down, so I won't be paraphrasing this. But you say, religion is always at risk of becoming a means of self-glorification, justifying the human by manipulating the divine. That quote stood out to me simply because I think for people involved in sports, that can always be a temptation.
Right.
Could you tease that out a little bit? Maybe it's not specifically what you see in sports, but maybe more the idea behind what you're getting at with that passage.
Yeah, so in that passage, I'm sort of talking about the need for revelation to come in and critique all of our religion. So if we think of religion in the traditional sense of sort of this thing that bubbles up from below, but bubbles up from within human culture, a reaching of humanity towards God, there have been a lot of theologians that have been pretty critical of religion as such, and like Karl Barth, for example, or Bonhoeffer, because of the ways that religion becomes a structure of legitimation, a way to say that the way that things are is the way that they always ought to be, because they are in some way rooted in the sacred order of things. And so the gospel comes as revelation. Jesus comes as revelation from outside every culture, and is able to be incarnate, in the sense the gospel can be incarnated into every culture, but it also brings a critique from the outside of every culture. So there's no culture that's so bad that that the gospel can't be communicated in its logic, but there's also no culture that the gospel doesn't bring a critique to, or bring something new that we could not have told ourselves or learned on our own. And so that's the sense that, the very best things that humans do, we will never on our own find the God revealed in Jesus Christ. The cross and the dynamics of the cruciform life are things that we would not have ever thought about on our own. And that's the sense in which revelation, especially the revelation of God in Christ, comes to critique all of our cultural practices. But it's across the board. It's including our church practices, right? It's not only the things that are out there in the world, as if the things that we do in church are somehow unfallen. It's everything we do needs to subject itself to the critique that comes to us in the gospel.
That's good. One other last dimension here with our last minute or two before we turn over to Katelyn, the aesthetic dimension. I couldn't help reading that chapter of Steph Curry. That's who came to mind for me. And I was thinking of athletes and the athletes who play with joy and who, when you watch them, it feels like you're witnessing artistry, right, in motion. Did that come to you? You mentioned a little bit, certainly you have a section there on play,
Yeah.
where you talk a little bit about sports. You sprinkle that in. Are there any athletes for you that strike that emotion that you enjoy seeing because it seems joyful and expressive and hits that aesthetic dimension?
Yeah, I mean, I love Steph Curry as well. I think that I teach a class on aesthetics here at Dort as well, and I always show gifs of particular athletes. Barry Sanders running with the football, Bo Jackson running up the wall. I'm from Kansas City, so Bo Jackson catching the ball and running up the wall. I forget the name of the skater now, but the Japanese skater that was the first one to do the triple axle or something like that. And just kind of watching the human form and movement is beautiful. And there's something about that we are meant, I think, to say that, to feel that collective effervescence when we all watch it together. There's something that we're deeply wired to connect with the human form in movement in that way.
Great. Thanks, Justin.
Yep.
Okay, we're going to turn over to our next panelist, Katelyn Beaty, author of Celebrities for Jesus. One of my favorite books this year, along with, I'd put Justin's on that list as well. I highlighted so many passages in the book. So Katelyn, we'll start just with your overview. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and kind of the big idea behind it and why you think it's needed in this cultural moment?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me participate in this panel, Paul. I am probably the least sportsy person here. In high school, I was in the marching band, so I was always on the sidelines watching the game. But when you first suggested this conversation to me, I immediately saw the connection to the world of sports, specifically professional athletes. And so that's the world that I'll reflect on toward the end of my introduction. But I wrote Celebrities for Jesus, not as a how-to manual on how to become a celebrity for Jesus, but a critique of celebrity power in the church, in contemporary evangelicalism. The origins of the book really came when I served as an editor at Christianity Today magazine, considers itself the flagship evangelical publication. And in the 10 years that I served there, our staff received multiple tips about famous Christian leaders, pastors, authors, kind of household names, people who I had grown up hearing about and knowing about. And as a journalistic publication, we were required to report on those allegations. And I think just over time, the more we got those tips, the more I started to think, is there something about celebrity itself that connects to abuses of power? Is there something about being put on a pedestal that allows you to think that you can evade accountability and use power for your own self-glory or gratification? So because of that experience and because of the observations at CT, I do take a pretty critical view of celebrity. I don't think of it as a neutral tool that any of us can, in our modern world, grab in kind of a pragmatic way. Evangelicals are a pragmatic people. And so the rationale might go something like, if you become a celebrity, if you have a big platform, you can use it to reach many more people with the gospel than you could in your kind of embodied day-to-day life. But I want to say, and what I have found is that, celebrity power misshapes us from within. And often we start with good intentions, thinking it's just a neutral tool, and it's actually something that is corruptive. So in the book, I do differentiate between celebrity and fame, which I think could be helpful for our conversations tonight. Fame is something that has arisen in every time and place, often in response to someone's creative work in the world, to their virtue, their leadership, their excellence, their military prowess and conquests. It's something that is a byproduct of work in the world, good or bad. And, as Christians, we might say, if you are serving the Lord and serving others, and fame comes to you as a byproduct, well, then you have to figure out how to steward it well. But just because someone is famous doesn't mean that they are in it for the wrong reasons, right? Celebrity is, by contrast, a modern phenomenon because it relies on the tools of mass media, really to project an image of oneself as important, impressive, whatever the things are that we want to believe about ourselves. And unlike fame, the focus is really on the person. And I think in this way, celebrity speaks to a modern hunger for a divine touch point, for transcendence, for having our kind of ultimate sense of meaning and purpose, and looking to people as heroes and models. So I think there's something more emotional and even religious going on with celebrity culture than there is with people who happen to be famous. I explore in the book a few different temptations of celebrity power. I've already alluded to this, but the abuse of power over other people, kind of thinking that you are above the rules or the law. This was a common thread in the stories that CT reported on. I think it's also, we see those celebrity dynamics and kind of the wealth and prestige that so often accompanies celebrity playing into recent stories of sexual abuse and the allegations against powerful celebrities. I talk about the platform industry of evangelicalism, and I critique the quest for platforms. This is really kind of an insider critique of Christian book publishing, which is the world that I inhabit day to day. I also talk about the temptation of creating a persona where there is a kind of division of the self, a kind of true self and false self. And the false self shows up dependent on the spotlight and the stage. And yet the true self that desires real connection, real intimacy, real proximity to other people is slowly being squelched. And so how do you get beyond a persona to connect with people as a person? So those are a few temptations I explore in the book. I do talk at the end of the book about why Christians like Christian celebrities in the worlds of entertainment, Hollywood, different musicians, kind of why they tend to champion figures. And so I think this is perhaps a lead-in to when we're thinking about the culture of professional athletes. And it really does strike me, and again, I have to foreground all of this by saying, I can barely remember what the teams are from Ohio. There are some Buckeyes, there are some Bears, but don't ask me any kind of scores or what ball belongs on which court. I'm going to get confused if I go too deep into the details. But if we're thinking about culture of professional sports, it does strike me, yes, this is a realm where athletes can become very powerful role models. They are arguably the most watched or most visible celebrities in the world today. You might think of someone like Justin Bieber or Hollywood actors and actresses, but I think just in terms of the sheer number of people in the United States and globally who tune into the world of professional sports every day, every week, I just think professional athletes are just in a tier of celebrity of their own. Going back to Justin's lens as religion, if sports touch on our desire for transcendence, then it strikes me that celebrated athletes are like gods or demigods in their capacity to hold our attention, our imagination, our devotion. Again, that there's a religious longing that these athletes are tapping into, and that comes out in our devotion and dedication to them. It also strikes me that there are, by comparison to the other worlds of entertainment, movies and music and the like, it does strike me that there seem to be a large number of outspoken Christian athletes. And I know this because I Googled lists of famous Christian athletes. I could name a few off the top of my head. The one who came to mind was, of course, Tim Tebow. You all mentioned Steph Curry before, Russell Wilson, Clayton Kershaw, Bubba Watson. Does this ring a bell? Okay, thumbs up. The retired coach, Tony Dungy. So I think when we're thinking about Christian celebrity athletes, there is an excitement here for a lot of Christians that these athletes can, again, thinking about celebrity as a pragmatic tool, they can use their platform to proclaim Christ to a watching world. In my book, I write about Willow Creek Church, a very influential mega church in the Chicago suburbs. And in the 80s, their former pastor was the chaplain to the Chicago Bears. This was a time of ascendance and glory for the Bears. And even a couple Bears players went to the church, a guy named Mike Singletary. And for Willow Creek, that was all just very exciting. These are people who we get to see in church every Sunday. We get to pray for them. And maybe with this platform and this attention, they can kind of speak well of Jesus and share the gospel with the celebrity power that they have. I would say, as is true for any time we overly attach to any celebrity figure, to proceed with caution, because of course, someone putting a Bible verse in their bio, it might be great, maybe somebody will be interested, but in terms of attendant character, integrity, just how someone lives off the field, we just can't really know that as fans. And in fact, to know questions of character, I would argue you shouldn't be a fan. You should be a friend to a celebrity athlete, a celebrity Christian athlete. And so then I think that raises questions about places where these celebrity Christian athletes can actually show up, not just as athletes. I mean, which would be very hard, I think, but where are the spaces where Tim Tebow can just be Tim? Are there fellowship networks? Are there chaplains who are really going to take the time to get to know these men and women? Are there places where these people can show up in ways that are real and vulnerable and don't feed into a fandom that they're so used to? Because I think that fandom can feel great for a while, and it can also be alienating over time. So I don't know how many spaces there are today for these famous Christian athletes, to be honest, off the field or the court. So I would love to hear others' thoughts on these themes, and any questions that arise based on these connections between celebrity power in the world of sports. I'm very eager to hear thoughts and questions.
Great. Thanks, Katelyn. Yeah, we're going to get to some questions. So if you have those, please chat those, put those into the Q&A box. You can throw them into the chat box as well if you'd like. One thought, reading your book, Katelyn, and thinking about sports, I think you're exactly right when you say there probably isn't an entertainment industry where there are more Christians than sports, right? You can look at music, movies, all of those areas. It's really rare to find someone who's like devoted out there follower of Christ. In sports, they're all over. Like there's a lot of them. And so that's interesting that there's this one sort of culture, so-called secular area of culture. There's a lot of Christians. And so I think the question of celebrity, when I've mentioned your book to people who work in sports ministry or who are in those sports spaces, they've been very interested in wanting to read it because they're around, they see what it does to athletes. They see some of the dehumanizing effects that happen when you're a famous athlete and people do look up to you as a god or a demigod, as you put it. It does something not just to the fan, but it does something to the celebrity athlete who's put in that position. and kind of assumes a sense of godlike status that can be harmful for them. So yeah, I think sports is uniquely positioned as this place where celebrity can be a problem for Christians. And then something else that you wrote in your book, I'll mention here, because I just thought this was, to me, a really profound way to think of it. You're talking about holiness. This is on page 161 of the book. If you have her book, you can go here. But you're talking about the way holiness is intended to, in many ways, it can be hidden. So you talk about hidden holiness, ordinary holiness. You say the moment we try to project it out for recognition or credibility, holiness loses some of its brilliance. And I'd be interested to hear other people's thoughts in the chat box or the Q&A. But it does seem that for many of us involved in sports, the point of being a Christian athlete is to project the recognition, to project the status of being a Christian, so that others will say, here's a successful athlete, I want to be like that too. And kind of the whole model of what it means to be a Christian athlete almost collapses if we were to say, no, actually, what we really need to be interested in is this quiet, ordinary, faithful following of Christ. And so there's these tensions and dynamics that I think your book does so well at naming, even though it's not about sports. I hope other folks read that and check that out too. Okay, let's get to some questions. We've got one that was just put in the chat box, but we'll get to a few Q&A ones here to start with. The first one here, and these could be either anonymous or if you want to put your name in, you can. But the first one is talking about following sport religiously. So Justin or Katelyn, either one of you can chime in, and feel free to, if you have questions for each other, you can hop onto these. It says, when we follow sport religiously, do we run the risk of becoming overly dogmatic or protectionist of the institution, even if it is an error? If so, how do we correct this? Let's start with you, Justin, but then Katelyn, I think your stuff on the church could apply really well here. So Justin, when you read that question, what's your sense or what's your thought?
Yeah, it's a very insightful question, first of all. In my book, I use religiously in sort of two different ways, a descriptive way and a normative way. So descriptively, as I talked about, when we talk about sport religiously, it again signifies that concern and consistency for our lives. And so that's not necessarily neutral, it's just descriptive, that almost anything like a television show can function religiously in our life. But then there's also this sort of normative sense of religiously that this questioner is kind of getting at, of that religion becomes a structure of legitimation, that it becomes a way that we get the meaning and that we kind of make sure that things stay the way that they are. And so that is absolutely one of the greatest pathologies of religion, that religion becomes attached to the preservation of the status quo being the way it is, because if it's not the way it is, will I still get the meaning from it that I was getting from it before? And so now we're talking about something like idolatry, which I think is what Katelyn's book gets at as well.
Katelyn, what are your thoughts on that? I know your book seems to be about this protectionist, dogmatic idea of protect the church first. So how might you apply some of your thoughts on what we do with the church if we think about treating sport religiously?
Yeah, well, there have been so many stories of churches, not the church as a whole, but churches as institutions that revolve around a charismatic celebrity figure who at some point is, facing allegations of misusing their power in a multitude of ways. And it's not comically laughable. It is laughably predictable how the pattern persists, that the people within both the inner circle, but also the fans of that celebrity leader immediately kind of go to protectionism and discredit the people bringing forward serious concerns. And some institutions do, over time, as more is learned, start to correct and repent and desire to seek the truth and to make right things that have been broken. But I think, in those stories, part of what's going on is this person brought me to Jesus, impacted my life in such positive ways, inspired me, maybe they're a mentor or a hero. If they fall, I'm losing something about my own identity, rightly or wrongly. I'm losing a sense of self. I'm losing a sense of meaning or identity that I get from my attachment to this community. And I just wonder if those dynamics can play out in our devotion to particular teams, if we're thinking about specific players who are facing allegations of misusing their power. The fans are probably the least, the last people who really want, and the coaches and the many people who have millions and millions of dollars to make off of that person continuing to play. But yeah, I think the idolatry framework is helpful because idols over time always exact a human cost. And so when we're thinking about the harm of people made in the image of God and a kind of refusal to reckon with that, I think it's safe to say we're dealing with an idol.
Rachel Dunn-Hollander, it's really two of the institutions that she's taken on, I guess you could say. It's sports and it's the church. These are the two spaces where there's been sexual abuse and there's been attempts to cover it up, to protect what's happening, whether it's within sports or the church. And so this is something she's talked about, is how she sees some of the dynamics you've mentioned, Katelyn, but connecting them in both of these spaces. And it's probably because, Justin, as you put it, when we have a sacred sense of what sports means to us, then we are more willing to turn a blind eye to its faults or its problems or those ways that it might not represent that sense of transcendence we want it to. So I think that's good to reflect on. This is a follow-up question that gets into this, I think is helpful. And it's a question about celebrity power from, it's our fourth question there, from Will. Shout out to Will, coming to us from Pennsylvania. He says, would you see a connection between celebrity power and the abuse of PED steroids in sports in regards to the ends justifying the means? What I'd like to say here is just thinking through that ends justifying the means part of it. And so, Justin, if you want to take that on, and then Katelyn, you see this in the book publishing industry, so I think you could have some helpful words for us there. Justin, how would you respond to this idea of ends justifying the means in terms of sports and celebrity?
Yeah, it's interesting to think of just in my book, I talk about play and how it's just such a fundamental thing that we do, and you add rules to the game, and then then it becomes like a sport and becomes regulated and commodified. And then if there's money on the line, like every layer increases the complexity and increases the capacity for, kids cheat in games they make up, right? That's just our natural human propensity to want to win. But whenever the higher the stakes, I mean, I don't know if this counts as a sport. I follow competitive chess, and there's been this major cheating scandal, that has rocked the world of chess, recently, and there's big money in chess now, and you sort of wonder, there's something like Olympic curling. Do they, they have cheating scandals in something like that, but whenever the sport gets bigger and bigger, the more it's easy to justify doing what needs to be done in order to win. And so I think, and this kind of relates to another question somebody asked, as far as the biggest critique of sports, is that as it becomes a machine, it starts to chew people up. And, the people who feel like they have to use PEDs to get ahead, or that's the only route forward for themselves as well, they're part of that machine, I think, that they're caught up in. And I think that's one of the ways that we know that we have a idolatry happening, where people feel like they have to do whatever it takes. That's where you're sacrificing something to a god, right? That you're sacrificing your integrity, but you're also willing to sacrifice others.
Katelyn, I'm interested, from your book, you had this rich discussion of it's book publishing, but I think that actually illuminates some of what happens in sports, because one of the things that's kind of unique about sports is that we have a scoreboard and we keep stats and we have numbers that quantify everything. So you sort of, you determine whether or not you are successful with the numbers that back it up and quantify it and show you. And we don't always have those spaces. A lot of times it's more subjective about who the best is. But in book publishing, numbers are kind of the way we do this. How many did you sell? And so there's a similar logic, I think, undergirding this idea of Christian uses of manipulating the book publishing lists and that sort of thing. Can
Mhm.
you talk us through a little bit of what you've seen in your research?
Yeah, that's such an interesting connection. I never would have made a connection between performance enhancing drugs and the purchasing of fake internet followers. But I guess that is, author hopefuls temptation, or their steroids. Yeah, I think you're right, Paul, that numbers rule in most trade book publishing. It's not to say that there aren't missional values at play, just as of course there are missional values at play in the world of professional sports. But in terms of thinking about self-worth and longevity and career success and how you rank against other people, book publishers, the numbers of how many books are sold are right there all the time. And they look at those numbers in large part to determine who they're going to enter into a book contract with, and some of that is, okay, how do we determine how many books we can sell? Well, let's look at their platform. Let's look at their numbers. How many social media followers do they have? How many newsletter subscribers do they have? And then over time, I see this happen, and I feel this temptation as well, that the numbers become the point rather than the craft, and rather than the message, or rather than the thing itself. They become the external good, and they replace the internal good of a writing or message. And I wonder how frequently that must happen in the world of sports. And I get that it feels really good to win, and I get that it feels really good to sell books, but you just wonder if there's so much pressure to win, if you start to wonder, are these athletes having fun anymore? Like, are they actually having fun, or are the pressures to succeed and perform so great that they've lost the internal good of the game itself? So that's a great connection.
And unfortunately, athletes don't have ghostwriters who can just go out and handle the play on the field for them. The person who asked that question clarified that he meant ends justifying the means in terms of leveraging Christian celebrity influence, which gets to what you were saying, Katelyn. So the idea would be an athlete who uses PEDs, hits more home runs, and now can tell more people about Jesus because they use PEDs to get this bigger platform.
Yeah, don't do that. That's bad. Jesus would not be pleased.
You heard it here. Don't use PEDs to enhance your.
I hadn't thought about that, but of course, my immediate thought is, yeah, but once the scandal comes out, that tarnishes the very gospel that you're hoping to share. That you lose the credibility of that message if you are shown to be trying to win with, performance enhancing drugs or steroids.
Okay, let's go to our next question. And this one is asking Justin specifically here on classes that he's teaching. Justin, how do you teach students to see the redemption of sports and faith in our culture today?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, I guess. And I think it sort of depends on the level of their engagement in sports culture. So some of them are athletes, right? Some of the students that I teach are athletes, and that's often a source of deep spiritual insight for them, especially when they get injured, for example, and their identity has been invested in sports. And I think a lot of us, it's not as much a source of wisdom for us because we don't feel the same sort of vulnerability that the athletes do, right? It's hard to get injured rooting for somebody. So I think that part of what I wanted students to do is to be curious about what's going on in the world of sports and why they love the teams they love so much, or why, sometimes if they don't understand, something like esports, for example, like why do people spend so much time watching other people play video games? Before you just judge that and say that's a waste of time, people are stupid, let's be curious and see what's happening here. and be compassionate, as far as where people are. So I think that's always the first move for a Christian, has to be a move of curiosity and compassion before a movement of judgment. But then ultimately we do have to, again, allow the gospel to bring the critique and completion. And I would say, again, I think the doctrine of justification by faith alone is really hugely important. The idea of having your identity found in Christ and not in your performance, which then actually frees you to perform and find joy in something again. And so redemption of sports, I think in a similar way would mean sort of those three pieces of curiosity, and then kind of confrontation of the gospel with this thing in my life that maybe is too important, and then finally this kind of creative action in response to the gospel.
That's good.
And I also show them Ted Lasso, the television show. That's a good word. That's a good place to start, I think.
Yeah, I love that. Katelyn, this next one I'd like you to take on. And again, I think I mentioned this at the beginning. I think it's really helpful for people in sports, especially, to see the way that the pressures, anxieties, stresses that athletes, coaches face. They're human pressures, stresses, anxieties. And so whether it's the realm of sports or some other space, there's going to be similar things going on. This question is specifically about your own position as an author, as someone who's put out a book. And you mentioned before, you have this pressure and temptation to want to sell more. It's the questioner says, do you have a personal mission statement or guidepost that helps you evaluate whether you are still on course in terms of your values, rather than slipping into the temptation to do more, sell more, engage more?
Oh, shoot. God sent this person to hold me accountable. No, that's really good. Yeah, that's a really great question. No, I'm thinking, as we're talking about sports and the joy of the game itself and how easy it is to get away from that joy, one thing I would just look at is like, am I having fun? Like, am I able to experience a kind of lightness and joy simply in talking about the themes of the book, seeing it resonate with people, having people read it and say, like, this really connected with me and made me think about something that happened at our church 20 years ago. And you just get that joy of, as a communicator, wanting to shape hearts and minds and ultimately wanting to serve other people. And if I'm able to focus on that and find joy in doing it, I'm in a good place. It's when I'm in the numbers, the followers, the platform, but if this doesn't work, will I, the worry and anxiety about the future, all of that leads me away. I know that that's me not having a great day. I would also say to, my job and my work requires me to be in front of a lot of screens throughout the day. But am I able and willing to reinvest in those embedded relationships with friends and family and people at church? And can I think about showing up to those spaces where the people there mostly don't care that I'm an author or whatever. They just want to connect as a fellow, Christian living in New York, or a Beaty family member, or whoever it is. And I just think we all need spaces like that to stay grounded as humans. And it's there that we're in places where we can be truly known and loved, where we find freedom. And so that would just be something that I hope to lean more into, regardless of what happens with books or writing in the future.
That's really good. Justin, I think we might want to take on the person who name drops Durkheim. What do you think? Should we do it?
Let's go. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
I wonder if that person has read my book, because it's very astute leveraging of three different dimensions in one question.
Yeah. How would you summarize that if you've read it? How would you summarize the kind of the heart of the question here?
Yeah, well, so I think that the second part of the question is a little bit more complicated, but it's trying to make sense of wielding the power lens, so the critical lens that looks at sports in terms of a systemic thing, structure of distraction or exploitation, alongside the sense that you can build a lot of goodwill through sports. So there's kind of two kinds of hammers, like a hammer that breaks things and a hammer that builds things. And so the critical lens tends to be more of like the iconoclastic hammer, and then the Durkheimian lens is more of a constructive hammer of trying to build a community of flourishing. And we need both. I think we need to be able to see structures of power without it becoming the only thing we see. Otherwise, we tend to just try to do iconoclasm and not actually see where people are resisting or subverting or investing meaning in ways that are outside of the traditional lines. So as far as the second part of the question, how can we think about grind culture as something that takes away from the aesthetic dimension of play, possibly even exploitative and more constructively as a theology of work that sees these efforts as goods in and of themselves? I think that's, again, really insightful. And I think diagnostic of something that's just a larger cultural phenomenon of grind and performancism, where discipline becomes sort of an endless self-improvement to become this fantasy self, that's always judging us, and so I think that's a really, I think, just well put thing that, again, I think justification by faith, David Zoll has a couple of really good books about this. I think Katelyn worked with him on at least one of them, about how justification by faith really helps break down that sense that we have that we must be the ones who make ourselves into this fantasy self that we're always failing to become. I think that's exactly right, that it compromises the aesthetic dimension of joy. And I use the phrase "just for the heaven of it" because heaven is a world of joy. And when we lose ourselves in the craft, we lose ourselves in whatever it is we're doing. It's a taste of that joy of heaven, where it's not about performance, but it's about sharing the joy that we find in doing something.
Yeah, I'll affirm what Sean put in the chat box. That phrase "just for the heaven of it" stood out to me in the book as well. And I'll add too, Justin, something I loved about your book was the way you're able to layer multiple understandings and meanings of something like sports. And like you said, wielding different hammers, where there's a critical lens, yes, but that's not the only thing that explains sports meaning to us. It's helpful, but it can become one-sided and unbalanced if we don't have these other lenses through which we can engage. So that's a really helpful way to approach it. I want to get to sports minister asked this question. This is someone who works in sports ministry, works with athletes. And so they're jumping off something that Katelyn mentioned. And this refers to Katelyn's definition of celebrity. And we can kind of wrap up here as we close our time this evening. The question is, and I'll remind you of what I put in the chat box. Katelyn wrote these words, so probably would know them. But Katelyn said that she's talking about celebrities' reliance on mass media. And she wrote that celebrity is social power without proximity. It's the chance to influence without knowing or being known by those you're influencing. Okay, so there's the definition that Katelyn provided. This person asked, for people in sports ministry, people who are chaplains who work with these Christian athletes, they sort of recognize that as true, exactly what you identified, that these celebrity Christian athletes are influencing without knowing or necessarily being known by the people they're influencing. In light of that, what can sports ministers do to help guide and inform that conversation? If they recognize celebrity as this potential problem, is there some practical guidance you can give them?
Gosh, I feel like all my thoughts are they feel over spiritualized, and I wish that they were more practical. But it just strikes me that people in sports ministry, chaplains, or different networks of various ministries can provide a place for these celebrity Christian athletes to drop the act, so to speak, and be transparent and honest about their anxieties about the upcoming game, or they have this sponsorship opportunity, but it's going to take them away from their family. All the kind of ethical and moral tensions that would come with a very peculiar kind of place to be a Christian. And so I just wonder if chaplains might lean into speaking the truth in love, asking difficult questions, but asking the questions from a posture of, I want to help you. I don't want you to get wrapped up in this. I don't want you to get lost in this. It's very easy to get lost in this. And then I also just think this would have to be applied so contextually and relationally, but I do think about the distinctly Christian call of, in the world of professional sports, as in so much of our world, we think about upward and to the right. That's where we all want to go. We all want, just a trajectory of increasing glory, jumping from glory to glory. And by contrast, the Christian story is really one of downward slope, a place where we are called to be putting others before ourselves, where we are not to be afraid of suffering or loss, where we believe Jesus is profoundly present to us in our losses and disappointments. And I just wonder if, theologically or spiritually, there is a freedom for Christian athletes who feel like they have to be on that upward trajectory to go lower as a place of true freedom and joy.
I'm posting in the chat box a post that gets at what you're articulating, Katelyn, and it's from Brian Gamble. He's a postdoc scholar with the Faith and Sports Institute, a New Testament scholar, and he writes about, for Christian athletes, this idea of greatness. And he's looking particularly at Jesus's call when the disciples ask him, like, what does it mean to be great, or who is the greatest? And essentially that Jesus calls us to downward mobility is the phrase that he uses. And what does that look like? It doesn't mean that we have to leave sports behind, but it does mean something about our dispositions, about what we're desiring, what we're seeking to achieve, about how we see ourselves in relation to others. And so for those of you who want to continue to think through that, check out Brian's post, because I think he has some helpful thoughts there. Well, Justin or Katelyn, any concluding thoughts that we've left out, anything ruminating in your mind as we wrap up here at 8:30?
Just want to say amen to everything Katelyn just said. And it made me think of Jeremy Lin, who is a favorite Christian athlete, who especially, not just when Linsanity happened, but, in recent years, some of his vulnerabilities and failures to make it back in the NBA, I think is a really good example of an athlete who has been very open and honest with the people that have followed him, and has modeled really what it looks like to follow Christ, not in winning everything, but also in losing as well.
Katelyn, any words of wisdom to close us out?
Just that I'm glad that that Justin had a concrete example of a professional athlete who has taken this path, because that was lost on me. But I do know who Jeremy Lin is, and I'm just grateful for such a countercultural witness in the world that he inhabits.
Amen. And I'll say there's a video of Jeremy Lin that came to mind, Justin, when you were sharing that, about his own struggle with feeling like a failure because he wasn't in the NBA. And I think it was so powerful to see a Christian athlete who, again, was not projecting an image of holiness, was not projecting an image of perfection, but somehow, despite having literally global fame, like there are a few athletes, basketball players, more famous globally than Jeremy Lin, yet somehow was able to just put himself on display. I use that not in a way for self-gain, but authenticity, where he's crying about this sense of loss he feels from the loss of his NBA career. And I do think there's something there that can be helpful as a model for Christian athletes to think about what it means to follow Christ, and to be willing to name appropriately. You don't have to put everything out there, but to name our weaknesses and vulnerabilities too. Excellent. Well, we had some people in the chat box saying this is a very fast and good hour of conversation. So I think we've done our part. We probably shouldn't keep going before we drag this on, and people aren't saying how quickly it went by. So thank you so much, Katelyn and Justin. Once again, I highly encourage all of you to read their books. Two of my favorite books this year. They deal with celebrity and culture and really life in the world. And sports are a part of culture, a part of the world. They will help you understand sports better and help you understand how to be a faithful Christian in our cultural context better as well. Check out too, if you don't know about the Faith and Sports Institute, Google us, check us out on Baylor's website. We have graduate programs and online certificate programs related to theology and sports and culture and other ways that you can learn and grow. So we'd love to get connected with you if you'll connect with us. You can also shoot me an email, and I would be happy to get in touch with you and talk with you more. Put my email in the chat box. So please do stay in touch, stay connected, and have a great night.